Rome didn't fall, it contracted. We have a picture of this. Barbarians at the gates, fire, a civilization at its absolute peak, and then silence. This picture is structurally wrong. What destroyed Rome wasn't invasion, it was hollowing. Power didn't vanish, it fragmented, localized, and quietly changed hands. The institution stayed. The authority drained out of it. By 550 AD, a merchant sailing from Constantinople to Massilia still found ports. The ships were smaller. The ports were emptier. The customs official wore a Roman uniform, but the coins in his hand bore a barbarian king's face. Not fire, not screaming, just smaller, slower, and more local, until the system you thought you were living inside had already been replaced. This isn't just Rome. This pattern is running again. If you're new here, I'm Jeremy Ryan Slate, and this channel is called The Roman Pattern. And what we do is honestly pretty simple. We take a civilization that spent 500 years coming apart, and we ask what actually killed it. Not the myth, not the version you got in the textbook, if you did at all, but how the thing really worked and where it really broke. For about a year now, we've been going through that piece by piece. The way the currency got debased, the way the borders gave out, the emperors who basically auctioned off the state to whoever would pay the most. It's all sitting there in the back catalog if you want to watch it. The last episode ended on a single date, 476, the day the last emperor in the West handed over his crown and just walked away from it. That's the day historians decided to call the end of the Roman Empire. If you haven't watched that one, the link's in the description. Because what I want to show you today really only lands if you understand how we got to that point. That episode was us working out what went wrong. This one is about what came after, what actually happened next. So here's the question I want to answer in this one. Not why Rome fell, because we've already spent a lot of time on that. The question is what it felt like from the inside while it was happening. What did a merchant actually see when he sailed into a port in 550 that he wouldn't have seen in 350? What would a peasant have picked up on, or a soldier? And the part I find most interesting, what did none of them notice at all? Because the dangerous thing about a civilization changing shape isn't the dramatic collapse. It's how normal everything feels while it's going on. I want to go through this in order, so we'll start with the cities, then move into trade, then daily life, and what actually changed there versus what stayed the same. After that, the one institution that quietly absorbed everything the empire left behind. And then at the end, I'll show you what this same pattern looks like when you find it running in a completely different century. So let's start with the cities, because the first thing everybody assumes, mostly because that's what movies show you, is that cities burned. And some of them did, but most of them didn't. Rome itself came through it. By 550, it was a much smaller place. Around the year 300, the city was holding somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people. And by 350, you're looking at something closer to 50,000. That's roughly a 90% drop in under 200 years. But the city was still there. It's worth pausing on why that number fell off a cliff right in that window. Procopius, who actually rode along with the Eastern Army during Justinian's campaign to take back Italy, describes Rome getting besieged and changing hands over and over through the 530s and 540s. So the population didn't really trickle away over centuries. It got beaten out of the place in a couple of genuinely brutal decades. And even after that, the Colosseum was still standing. Some of the aqueducts were still running. And the Bishop of Rome was still holding court inside the old government buildings. The physical empire was still there. The one thing missing was the empire itself. Constantinople, by contrast, didn't shrink at all. In 550, it was the most powerful city in the Western world. And the Eastern Roman Empire, the thing we call Byzantium, was completely intact. Still collecting its taxes, still putting armies in the field, and still writing law. This part really matters. When we say Rome fell, what we actually mean is the western half of it. The eastern half just kept going for another 1,000 years. And that one fact pretty much takes apart the idea that this was some total collapse of civilization. What you're really looking at is a political reorganization that was devastating in the West and barely registered in the East. You could see the same thing in other big cities. Alexandria came through. Antioch came through. Massilia, which is modern Marseille, came through. These were the anchor points of the Mediterranean economy. And as long as the Mediterranean itself was holding together, so were they. Then look at what actually died. Take Trier. In 300, Trier was the most important city in the Western Roman world. It was the seat of Western emperors for most of the 3rd and 4th centuries, with a palace, a circus, bath complexes bigger than anything in Rome. By 550, it had shrunk to a small town. The palace had become a church. The baths had been turned into a quarry. And the circus was somebody's farmland. Britain had it even worse. The Romans pulled out in 410, and it wasn't really an invasion that drove them out so much as the plain fact that they could no longer afford to keep the garrison there. Within 50 years, the villas were sitting abandoned. The roads were still there, but nobody was bothering to repair them. The town shrank back to fortified hilltops. Literacy fell apart. And in under a century, Britain went from a Roman province to something closer to an Iron Age tribal setup. So what's the actual difference between Rome and Trier, or between Alexandria and Britain? It comes down to power, and not military power either. Administrative power. The cities that made it were the ones that stayed plugged in to the working administrative network. Constantinople was running on the eastern one. Rome was becoming the seat of the papacy, which was a brand new administrative network growing right on top of the old imperial one. Alexandria and Antioch were still wired into Eastern trade and governance. Trier had lost its emperor, and Britain had lost its garrison. And once that connection was gone, the city just stopped functioning as a city and slid back into being a big village. That's the real fault line, and it isn't fire and it isn't barbarians. It's organized power pulling out. Now let's get into the economy. Back in a book that came out in 1937, a Belgian historian named Henri Pirenne made an argument that most people outside the academic world would just never have come across. What he says was that Rome didn't really end in 476 at all. The Roman economic world, meaning the whole Mediterranean trade system, actually kept running for another 200 years after that. What finally killed it, in his telling, was the Arab conquest of North Africa and the Levant in the 7th century, because that cut the Mediterranean clean in half. And once it was cut, the Western economy finally dropped down into real subsistence. I think Pirenne was partly right. The trade clearly didn't stop in 476, but it did contract. And that contraction is the thing that you want to be watching. Think about what was possible in 300. A jar of olive oil could move from North Africa all the way to the Rhine frontier without changing hands more than a couple times, because the infrastructure was that dense. You had the roads, the ports, the customs houses, the warehouses, all of it coordinated by an administrative system running on Roman law. By 550, that same jar of oil might still have made it as far as Massilia, but getting up the Rhine now meant that 3 more transactions, a couple more middlemen, and a road that hadn't seen any maintenance in 40 years. This is where the money problem turns into something physical. The debased currency didn't just wipe out people's savings. It killed off the reason to trade over long distances in the first place. Once you stop trusting the coin, you stop extending credit. And once nobody's extending credit, nobody's shipping. And when the shipping dries up, the ports get smaller. And when the ports get smaller, the city around it gets smaller as well. That's the chain reaction. And every link in it snaps from the same original failure, which is that the state could no longer afford to stand behind its own money. So by 550, the Mediterranean economy was still up and running, just at a fraction of what it used to be. And it was falling back on barter in places that had never needed barter before. The merchants were still out there. The ships were just smaller. The routes were shorter. And there was a lot less money in it. That's not a collapse, it's a contraction. And a contraction is a much harder thing to see, which is exactly why most people don't catch it until it's already finished. Now let's shrink it down further, past the cities and the trade routes, all the way down to one person. Say a craftsman in a mid-sized town in southern Gaul in the year 550. What does his actual life look like? He wakes up in a house that's still recognizably Roman in the way it's built. And not because somebody just put it up. It's because the house his great-grandfather built simply hasn't fallen down yet. Roman construction was that good. He speaks a kind of Latin, too. Not the classical Latin of textbooks. That's already breaking up into regional dialects. But it's clearly still Latin. If you dropped him in front of a Roman citizen from 300, he could more or less make himself understood about the way a modern American could work things out with someone from the 1790s. So it's tricky, but it's doable. The market, though, is a different story. Back in 300, his town would have had a weekly market, carrying goods all over the empire. Pottery coming up from North Africa, glass from Syria, and grain out of Egypt. By 550, that market has gone local. The North African pottery has thinned right out, since the high-end decorated workshops fell apart after the Vandals took Carthage. And even the ordinary, everyday stuff is showing up less reliably and costing more. The Syrian glass still turns up, just not as often or not as cheap. The Egyptian grain now gets routed through Constantinople before it ever reaches it. The market's still there. It's just smaller and a narrower version of itself. Then there's the services side of things. In 300, if you had a legal dispute, it went in front of a Roman magistrate, somebody trained in law, appointed by the state, and working from Roman law. By 550, that magistrate is just gone. What you got in his place is a bishop, or maybe the agent of some Visigothic king, who picked up his Roman law from a manuscript that got copied out of a monastery by men who'd never laid eyes on a Roman emperor. So the law itself is still mostly Roman, but the person handing it down to you isn't. And that shift turns out to matter a lot. Because the bishop isn't only settling your disputes. He's the one handing out grain when there's a famine, running whatever passes for a local hospital, organizing whatever road repair actually gets done. He's basically the welfare officer and the courthouse and the town council rolled into one man. And all of it is being paid for by the church rather than the empire. This is the last stage of that power handover. The empire's authority was draining out of imperial hands. Slowly at first, and then completely. And the thing it drained into was the Catholic Church, not one of the barbarian kingdoms. Now flip it over and look at the other side, the things that didn't change. Because this is where the standard story really falls apart. The peasant out in southern Gaul is still farming the same land his family always farmed, same crop rotations, same irrigation channels, and in a lot of cases the same tax bill, except now it's being paid to a Visigothic king instead of a Roman emperor. And it's structured in exactly the same way, because the Visigoths simply took over the existing Roman tax records and kept using them. He didn't sit down and redesign the system. He just stepped straight into it. Roman laws survived too. Not everywhere, and not in perfect shape, but the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths and the Burgundians all produced their own law codes. And every one of these codes is built on Roman models. They held on to Roman law for the simple reason that it worked, because tribal custom was never going to be able to run a complicated urban economy. Even with everything coming apart, the old system was still worth copying. The shape of the household didn't change either. You still got the family unit, the parents and the children, and the wider kin around them, holding steady. The old feast days got folded into the Christian calendar instead of being thrown out. The local gods quietly turned into saints. The temples turned into churches. The forum became the marketplace, and the government building down the street became a cathedral. Same stones, just a different name over the door. This is what one of these transformations actually looks like when you're standing at the street level. There's no fire and no sudden silence, just the slow pileup of small substitutions, each one basically invisible by itself, and all of them quietly pointing the same way. Now bring geography into it, because none of this happened evenly. It was wildly different from one region to the next. Italy under the Ostrogoths was, by the standards of the day, remarkably well run. Theodoric kept the Roman Senate where it was, kept the Roman civil service intact, governed through Roman law, put Romans into administrative posts, and kept the infrastructure going at the same level that genuinely startled people watching at the time. And we know this in real detail because of a man named Cassiodorus, a Roman senator who worked for Theodoric and wrote the king's official correspondence in a style you'd swear came straight from Augustus. We're not guessing here either. The whole collection of his letters, the Verii, actually survive. You can sit and read the Ostrogothic government talking in flawless Roman bureaucratic Latin, arranging grain shipments and aqueduct repairs as though Augustus himself were still signing off on the paperwork. Same titles, same formulas, same basic assumption that Roman order was simply how things were done. Theodoric had grasped something that a lot of conquerors never do, which is that the system was worth far more than the territory. You don't burn the whole thing down that you've just inherited. You keep it running. Southern Gaul went most the same way. The Rhone and the Saône were still working as trade highways. Massilia was still a live port, and the bishops were still keeping civic life going through the Roman administrative networks they'd inherited. The infrastructure was scaled down, but it was still genuinely infrastructure. Northern Gaul is where it starts to look different. The Rhine frontier had been the very edge of the empire. So when the empire pulled inward, the frontier pulled in right along with it. The Franks who'd moved into northern Gaul were a good deal less Romanized than the Visigoths were. Their law codes leaned more tribal. Their way of governing was far more personal, and a king's authority basically came down to whatever he could enforce in person, rather than anything written into a legal framework run by trained officials. Britain is the extreme of the whole spectrum. The cultural collapse there was unlike anything else in the post-Roman West. Latin died out as a spoken language within 2 generations of the Romans leaving. And the pottery tells the same story in an even starker way, because the mass-produced Roman wheel-thrown pottery that you find at every single Romano-British site just stops dead around 450. There's no gradual decline and no switch to something else. The whole production base simply ceases to exist. And this is the one spot where the catastrophe school of historians really has the goods. Brian Ward Perkins, who, by the way, I read a lot in grad school, built an entire book around exactly this point. That when you can watch cheap, good mass-produced pottery vanish from the record, what you're really watching is a genuine collapse in people's standard of living, not some polite transformation. And on Britain, he's dead right. The potter's wheel and the kiln actually disappear, and people go back to making pots by hand. I'd just like to add that Ward Perkins would argue with a gentler contradiction reading that I'm giving you for the rest of the empire. Britain is the place where even the optimists admit the bottom dropped out completely. This is the border problem showing its teeth. The empire held a perimeter, and when that perimeter moved, the civilization sitting behind it didn't always come through at the same level. The further you were from the new centers of power, from Constantinople, from Rome, from the church's network, the harder and faster you slid backwards. Being a long way from the center was basically a death sentence for any kind of Roman complexity. The center was doing a lot more than just handing down governance. It was creating the conditions that let the complexity exist at all. Take the center away, and the complexity can't hold itself up. So it falls back toward whatever people can keep going at a local level. Now we get to the institution that soaked all this up, and this is much more than a religious story. It's probably the most successful handover of institutional power in the whole history of the West. By 550, the Catholic Church was carrying out basically every function the imperial administration had been handling since back in 350. The tax collection was still happening. It was just called tithes now. Dispute resolution was still happening under the name of canon law. Welfare had become charity. The upkeep of infrastructure had become the work of the monasteries. Record-keeping moved into the scriptoria, and education ran through the cathedral schools. Same jobs, new labels. I went deeper on the Vatican's particular role in taking over these state functions in a companion video, and that link's in the description. But the point I want to make here is about actually how it happened. The church stepped into the empire, and it took it over. And it could do that because it was the one institution with the geographic reach, the administrative skill, and the genuine authority to fill the gap the empire had left. The bishops were using the Roman road network. They were writing in Latin. They organized their own authority along the old Roman provincial boundaries. They even took over the Roman title pontifex, the words Romans used for their chief priests, which literally means bridge builder. And the Bishop of Rome picked up that title and simply never let go of it. This is what power looks like when the handover goes smoothly. It doesn't make any announcement. It just moves into the empty spaces the old power left behind. It borrows the language of the system it's replacing. It keeps all the familiar forms in place and quietly swaps out what's inside them. By the time anybody notices that the switch has happened, The new institution has already been doing the old jobs for a generation. The whole thing finishes before it ever becomes visible. By 600, the Catholic Church was the single most powerful institution in the Western world, and it got there without conquering anyone. It just outlasted everything else around it. So that's what life actually looked like once Rome had fallen. The cities got smaller, but they didn't vanish. The trade routes pulled in, but they kept running. The Latin broke apart, and what it broke into was French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and Romanian. 5 living languages that more than 1 billion people speak today. Roman law got rewritten by barbarian kings, and it still ended up as a foundation under every Western legal system that came after. The Roman infrastructure crumbled, and the church just kept enough of it patched together to keep the network breathing. The story most people grew up with is that Rome fell and the lights went out. The truth is harder than that. Rome shrank down into something smaller, and that smaller thing turned out to be the seed of everything that came next. So medieval Europe was really Rome carrying on at reduced capacity. Now, the part that actually matters here is less about history and more about learning to spot a pattern. What does one of these transformations look like from the inside? It looks like the institution's still taking over. The ceremony's still being held. The old title's still in use. All the familiar forms kept carefully in place long after the thing inside them has changed. This is more or less the argument that Peter Heather has spent his career making. That Rome didn't just quietly rot from the inside on some schedule of its own. The forms held and the paperwork held. But the thing that was actually funding and defending the whole apparatus got eaten away underneath. And once that was gone, the inheritance got carved up by whoever happened to be standing closest. Think about that merchant in 550 again. He paid his customs duty. He just had no idea whether the empire behind that customs office still existed. The peasant paid his taxes to a man in a Visigothic uniform, reading off a Roman tax ledger. The bishop handed down Roman law, only now he did it in the name of God instead of the emperor. The same system underneath, different names on top. And that's the thing that most people miss. What looks like a civilization ending is really a civilization changing hands. And the moment it changes hands, it stays invisible right up until it's finished. And by then, the new system has been running long enough that everyone just assumes it was always there. None of this is unique to Rome. It happens anytime the center loses its grip on holding the system together. The system gets inherited rather than destroyed, picked up by whoever's organized and legitimate enough to take over the jobs that the center can't manage anymore. The money fails, the borders thin out, the power moves on, and whatever fills that empty space becomes the next civilization. In the next video, we're going to follow that same pattern forward into what the church actually built on top of the ruins of the Western Empire, and what it stripped out of those ruins to build with. That link's going to be in the description once it's actually live, so if you're watching this later on, you're going to get to see it and it's already there. If not, you can wait for it. And if the series is new to you, there's a Start Here playlist down in the description that lays out the whole thing in order, because it honestly makes a lot more sense if you watch everything. This has been The Roman Pattern. I'm Jeremy Ryan Slate. Do me a favor and like this video, leave us a comment, and hit that subscribe button if you want more of The Roman Pattern.